July 7, 1937, 1040 p.m. Wanping Fortress, just southwest of Peiping. The humid summer air hangs heavy over the Lugu Bridge, known to the west as the Marco Polo Bridge, where the stone lions stare blindly into the darkness. Private Kikujiro Shimura of the Japanese garrison army has vanished into the shadows for a momentary unauthorized break, and his absence triggers a chain reaction that will ignite the world. His company commander, claiming the Chinese captured the soldier, demands entry into the walled town of Wanping to search for him, a pretext that carries the weight of inevitable conquest. When the Chinese garrison commander Colonel Ji Xingwen refuses the demand to open the gates, the silence of the night shatters under the roar of artillery. Japanese shells slam into the ancient masonry, sending plumes of dust and stone into the ink-black sky, signaling the end of uneasy peace and the beginning of total war. This is not merely a border skirmish or a diplomatic misunderstanding. It is the spark hitting the powder keg of rising nationalism and imperial ambition. Within hours, negotiations crumble as reinforcements from both sides flood the area, transforming the localized incident into a full-scale invasion. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, realizing that appeasement has only invited further aggression, makes a fateful decision from his headquarters in Kuling. He declares that the limits of endurance have been reached, mobilizing the National Revolutionary Army to confront the technologically superior Japanese war machine. The focus of the war quickly shifts from the dusty plains of the north to the industrialized, cosmopolitan hub of Shanghai in the east. Chiang decides to open a second front here, hoping to draw the Japanese into an urban quagmire that will negate their advantages in armor and heavy artillery. August 13, 1937, marks the beginning of the Battle of Shanghai, a conflict so intense it will later be remembered as the Stalingrad of the Yangtze. In the narrow, winding streets of the Jiabei district, the fighting descends into a brutal, close-quarters nightmare where the front lines are measured in meters and rooms. The elite German-trained divisions of the Chinese army, equipped with Stahlhelm helmets and Mauser rifles, throw themselves against the Japanese Marines in a desperate bid to push them back into the Huangpu River. The air fills with the stench of cordite, rotting debris, and unburied bodies. Japanese warships anchored in the river, including the cruiser Izumo, unleash a relentless barrage of heavy naval gunfire that obliterates entire city blocks. The ground trembles rhythmically as 12-inch shells pulverize concrete and flesh alike, turning the bustling metropolis into a jagged landscape of ruins. Despite the overwhelming firepower raining down from the ships and the dominance of Japanese aircraft in the skies above, the Chinese soldiers hold their ground with tenacious, almost suicidal bravery. They utilize rubble as cover, engaging enemy tanks with Molotov cocktails and bundled grenades in desperate suicide charges. The carnage at the battleground known as the Flesh Grinder in the town of Luodian demonstrates the terrifying cost of modern industrialized warfare. Wave after wave of Japanese infantry charges through the rice paddies under the cover of artillery smoke, only to be mowed down by dug-in Chinese machine gun nests. The soil turns into a bloody slush as rain mixes with the gore of thousands of fallen soldiers from both sides. For weeks, the stalemate holds, costing Japan far more blood and treasure than their general staff had ever anticipated in their swift war plans. By late October, however, the strategic situation for the Chinese defenders becomes critical as a fresh Japanese landing at Hangzhou Bay threatens to encircle their positions. Chiang Kai-shek orders a general retreat to preserve the core of his army, but he leaves behind a single battalion to cover the withdrawal and make a political statement to the watching world. Lieutenant Colonel Xie Jinyuan leads roughly 400 men of the 524th Regiment into the Sihang warehouse, a 6-story concrete fortress situated just across the creek from the international settlement. For 4 days and nights, the 800 heroes, as they come to be known to hide their true, smaller numbers, hold off relentless Japanese assaults. Western journalists and civilians watch from the safety of the international settlement just yards away, witnessing a surreal theater of war where heroism plays out in plain sight. A young girl guide named Yang Huimin risks her life to swim across the Suzhou Creek under the cover of darkness, delivering a Republic of China flag. When the flag rises over the warehouse the next dawn, it offers a fleeting, defiant symbol of hope amidst the smoke of a burning city. The fall of Shanghai in November shatters the illusion that China can hold the coast, opening the road to the capital, Nanking. The retreat turns into a disorganized rout as exhausted Chinese units clog the roads, strafed relentlessly by Japanese Zero fighters that swoop down like hawks. Morale disintegrates as command structures fracture, leaving soldiers and civilians alike vulnerable to the advancing Imperial Japanese Army. The Japanese troops, angry and humiliated by the unexpected resistance in Shanghai, march toward Nanking with a dark thirst for retribution, fueled by propaganda and the brutality of the preceding months. Inside Nanking, chaos reigns as the government begins to evacuate deeper into the interior, leaving General Tang Shengzi to defend the capital. He publicly vows to live or die with the city, ordering the gates locked and the evacuation boats destroyed to prevent retreat, a decision that essentially traps the civilian population and the garrison. As December arrives, the Japanese army of central China, under the command of General Matsui Iwane and Prince Asaka, encircles the ancient walls, dropping leaflets demanding surrender that are ignored by the fractured Chinese leadership. On December 9, the Japanese launch a massive assault on the city walls, focusing their rage on the gate of Guanghua. The defenders fight with the desperation of the doomed, but they are outgunned and outmaneuvered by an enemy sensing total victory. By December 12, the defensive lines collapse completely, and General Tang Shengji flees the city without effectively organizing a withdrawal for his men. The leaderless soldiers panic, discarding their uniforms and weapons in the streets, hoping to blend in with the civilian population to escape the approaching vengeance. December 13, 1937, marks the entry of the Japanese troops into Nanking and the beginning of 6 weeks of horror that will stain history forever. What follows is not a battle, but a systematic purge sanctioned by the implicit and explicit approval of the Japanese command. Soldiers roam the streets, executing any man suspected of being a soldier, often identified merely by calluses on their hands or the marks of a helmet strap. The banks of the Yangtze River become execution grounds where thousands of prisoners are bound, machine-gunned, and dumped into the freezing waters. The violence quickly spills over to the civilian population, escalating into a frenzy of rape, looting, and murder that defies comprehension. Women of all ages, from elderly grandmothers to young children, are dragged from their homes and subjected to unimaginable brutality by gangs of laughing soldiers. The streets are littered with corpses that are left to rot, creating a stench that permeates the winter air. 2 Japanese officers, Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda, even engage in a contest to see who can be the first to behead 100 people, a grotesque competition reported on by Japanese newspapers as if it were a sporting event. Amidst this hellscape, a small group of foreigners led by German businessman John Rabe and American missionary Minnie Vatrin establishes the Nanking Safety Zone. They use their status and the Nazi flag, ironically respected by the Japanese allies, to shield roughly 200,000 Chinese civilians from the slaughter. Rabe patrols the zone tirelessly, physically pulling Japanese soldiers off victims and documenting the atrocities in his diary. These few square miles become the only sanctuary in a city that has been turned into a slaughterhouse, a tiny island of humanity in a sea of blood. The massacre at Nanking serves a strategic purpose in the minds of the Japanese leadership to terrorize the Chinese government into immediate capitulation. They believe that such a devastating display of power and cruelty will break the will of the Chinese people and force Chiang Kai-shek to the negotiating table. However, the sheer scale of the atrocity has the opposite effect, galvanizing the Chinese resistance and ensuring that surrender is no longer a political possibility. The blood of Nanking hardens the resolve of the nation, transforming a war for territory into a war for survival. As 1937 draws to a close, the Japanese military stands victorious in the ruins of the capital. Believing the war is effectively over, they celebrate their triumph with victory marches and sake, unaware that they have merely walked into a vast strategic trap. The Chinese government has not capitulated but has simply moved further west, trading space for time, drawing the Japanese deeper into the vast, Rugged interior. The China incident has evolved into a quagmire that will consume 1 million lives and eventually merge with a global conflagration, sealing the fate of the Japanese Empire. Spring 1938 brings a glimmer of hope to the battered Chinese forces gathering in the Shandong province, specifically around the railway junction of Taizhuang. Following the horrors of Nanking, the Japanese Imperial Army pushes northward with an air of invincibility, expecting another rapid collapse of the Chinese defense lines. However, General Li Zongren, commanding the 5th War Area, orchestrates a masterful trap, luring the overconfident Japanese 10th Division into the narrow streets of the town. For weeks, hand-to-hand combat rages inside the walled city, where Chinese soldiers, armed with broadswords and grenades, fight with a ferocity that stuns the invaders. The Battle of Taizhuang concludes in early April as the first major Chinese victory of the war, shattering the myth of Imperial Japanese invincibility. The retreat of Japanese forces leaves behind captured tanks and thousands of bodies, providing a critical morale boost to a nation on the brink of despair. Yet, this victory is fleeting, serving only to enrage the Japanese High Command, who respond by pouring reinforcements into the region to encircle the Chinese armies at Suzhou. To avoid annihilation, the Chinese conduct a strategic withdrawal, melting away into the countryside and leaving the Japanese to punch at empty air. As the Japanese war machine turns its gaze toward Wuhan, the industrial heart of central China, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek makes a decision of terrifying calculation to halt their advance. In June 1938, with the enemy closing in on the vital railway hub of Zhengzhou, Chiang orders the destruction of the dikes holding back the Yellow River at Huayuankou. The massive explosion unleashes a biblical torrent of water, silt, and mud that crashes across the plains of Henan, Anhui, and Jiangsu. The flood waters create a massive artificial swamp, effectively blocking the path of the Japanese mechanized divisions. The strategic success of the Yellow River flood comes at a humanitarian cost that defies comprehension, sacrificing the lives of the peasantry to save the army. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians drown in the sudden deluge, and millions more are left homeless, starving, and destitute in the resulting famine. The muddy quagmire successfully stalls the Japanese advance on Wuhan for several months, buying precious time for the government to relocate factories, universities, and cultural treasures deeper into the interior. This scorched earth policy signals a grim new reality. China is willing to endure self-inflicted amputation to ensure its survival. By the summer of 1938, the focus of the entire war shifts to the sprawling tri-city area of Wuhan, lying on the banks of the Yangtze River. The Battle of Wuhan becomes the largest engagement of the conflict, involving over 1 million Chinese troops and 350,000 Japanese soldiers. Unlike the chaotic rout at Nanking, the Chinese defense here is organized and stubborn, utilizing the rugged terrain of the Yangtze Valley to inflict maximum casualties. The river itself becomes a deadly arena, filled with mines and patrolled by Chinese gunboats attempting to harass the Japanese naval supply lines. In the skies above Wuhan, a fierce air war develops, featuring a motley coalition of Chinese pilots and the Soviet volunteer group. Soviet Polikarpov fighters engage Japanese A-5M monoplanes in swirling dogfights, temporarily challenging Japan's air superiority and boosting the morale of the defenders on the ground. Below them, in the sweltering heat of the Wanjialing region, the Chinese score another tactical victory by encircling the Japanese 106th Division. The fighting is savage and primal, fought in dense forests where malaria and dysentery prove as lethal as bullets, decimating the ranks of both armies. Frustrated by the stiffening resistance and the slow pace of the campaign, the Japanese Imperial Army authorizes the widespread use of chemical weapons to break the stalemate. During the heavy fighting around Wuhan, Japanese artillery units fire thousands of shells containing mustard gas and lewisite into Chinese positions. The toxic clouds burn the skin and lungs of poorly equipped Chinese soldiers who lack gas masks, forcing them to retreat or die in agonizing suffocation. This violation of international protocols underscores the ruthlessness of the Japanese drive to conclude the China incident before their resources run dry. Despite the heroic resistance, The sheer weight of Japanese firepower and their control of the river eventually make the defense of Wuhan untenable. In October 1938, Chiang Kai-shek orders a general retreat, but this time the withdrawal is disciplined and orderly, denying the Japanese the decisive knockout blow they crave. The Chinese army slips away to the west, leaving behind a burning, empty city, stripped of its industrial capacity. The Japanese capture Wuhan, but it is a hollow victory that leaves them overextended, bogged down in a hostile land with no end to the war in sight. The Chinese government retreats further inland to the mountainous city of Chongqing in the Sichuan province, establishing it as the wartime capital. Surrounded by steep gorges and perpetually shrouded in heavy fog, Chongqing is a natural fortress that is virtually impossible for the Japanese army to reach by ground. The city becomes the beating heart of free China, a chaotic mix of refugees, soldiers, bureaucrats, and spies, all clinging to the cliffs above the Yangtze. Here, the strategy of trading space for time reaches its zenith, forcing Japan into a protracted war of attrition it cannot afford. Unable to invade Chongqing by land, the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters initiates a campaign of terror bombing designed to break the Chinese will to resist. Beginning in 1939, waves of Japanese bombers launch Operation 100, targeting the defenseless civilian population of the mountain capital. Because Chongqing is built largely of wood and bamboo, the Japanese utilize incendiary bombs to create firestorms that consume entire neighborhoods in minutes. The city becomes the most heavily bombed place on Earth at that time, a testing ground for the concept of strategic aerial warfare against civilians. Life in Chongqing moves underground as the air raid sirens wail, their mournful sound echoing off the canyon walls day and night. The population burrows into the sandstone cliffs, constructing a vast network of tunnels and caves that house factories, hospitals, and government offices. Civilians spend hours or even days in these dark, damp shelters, listening to the muffled thuds of explosions destroying their homes above. The resilience of the Chongqing people becomes legendary as they emerge from the rubble after each raid to rebuild, their spirit unbroken by the rain of fire. The bombing campaign culminates in tragedies like the tunnel suffocation incident, where panic and poor ventilation lead to the deaths of thousands seeking shelter. Yet, the Japanese strategy of terror fails to induce surrender. Instead, it deepens the hatred and resolve of the Chinese populace. The constant attacks serve as a daily reminder of the existential threat posed by Japan, uniting the disparate factions of Chinese society against the common enemy. Even the fragile united front between the nationalists and the communists holds, albeit tenuously, under the pressure of the relentless aerial assault. While the main front stabilizes into a stalemate, the Japanese turn to political warfare, successfully courting the defecting nationalist rival Wang Jingwei. In 1940, Wang establishes a collaborationist government in Nanking, claiming to be the legitimate ruler of China under the banner of peace, anti-communism, and national construction. This political betrayal strikes a psychological blow to the resistance, offering a tempting illusion of peace to a war-weary population. However, the puppet regime fails to gain genuine popular support. Viewed largely as a tool of the Japanese military occupation, by 1940, the Japanese Empire finds itself trapped in the very quagmire that prudent strategists had warned against years earlier. They hold the major cities and railways of eastern China, but the vast countryside remains under the control of nationalist guerrillas and communist partisans. The imperial army is forced to garrison huge territories, bleeding manpower and resources in constant skirmishes that yield no strategic gain. The war in China has become a bottomless pit, consuming the oil, steel, and rubber that Japan desperately needs to maintain its industrialized economy. The situation worsens for Japan as the geopolitical landscape shifts with the outbreak of war in Europe in September 1939. The United States and Britain, sympathetic to China's plight, begin to tighten the economic noose around Japan, restricting the export of vital war materials. The Burma Road, a treacherous mountain highway carved by hand, becomes China's lifeline to the outside world, bringing in American trucks and fuel. Japan realizes that it cannot win the war in China without cutting off this supply line and securing new sources of raw materials. The failure to force a Chinese surrender at Wuhan and the resilience of Chongqing forced Tokyo to look beyond the Asian mainland for a solution. The Imperial Navy argues that the only way to secure the resources needed to finish the war in China is to strike south, toward the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and the rubber plantations of Malaya. This strategic pivot, born out of the frustration of the Chinese quagmire, sets the Japanese Empire on a collision course with the Western powers. The decision is made to win in China. They must set the rest of the world on fire. By the summer of 1941, the war in China has effectively stalemated, leaving the Empire of Japan in a precarious economic stranglehold. In response to the Japanese occupation of French Indochina, President Franklin D. Roosevelt freezes all Japanese assets in the United States and imposes a total oil embargo. This decision creates an existential crisis for Tokyo, as the Imperial Navy relies entirely on imported American oil to fuel its battleships and aircraft carriers. The clock begins to tick loudly in the halls of the Imperial General Headquarters, where military planners calculate they have less than 18 months of fuel reserves remaining before their war machine grinds to a halt. Faced with the choice of a humiliating withdrawal from China to lift the embargo or seizing the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, the Japanese leadership chooses the path of escalation. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, realizes that striking south to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies will inevitably draw the United States into the conflict. Despite his personal misgivings about waking the American industrial giant, Yamamoto conceives a daring, preemptive strike designed to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet at its anchor. He gambles that a knockout blow will buy Japan the 6 months needed to fortify a defensive perimeter that the Americans will never be able to penetrate. On November 26, 1941, the Kaido Butai, a massive strike force centering on 6 fleet aircraft carriers, slips quietly out of Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands. Under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the fleet maintains strict radio silence as it navigates the rough, freezing waters of the North Pacific to avoid detection by merchant shipping. On the flight decks, mechanics work with frozen fingers to prepare the Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers and Aichi D-3A dive bombers for the mission of their lives. The pilots spend their final hours studying mock-ups of Pearl Harbor, memorizing the topography of Oahu and the specific berths of the American battleships. Sunday, December 7, 1941. Dawns with a deceptive calm over the island of Oahu, where the U.S. Pacific Fleet lies resting in the harbor. At 7:55 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft, led by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, breaks through the cloud cover, the red circles on their wings gleaming in the morning sun. Fuchida fires a flare and radios the code, Tora, 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 back to the fleet, signaling that total surprise has been achieved. Below them, American sailors are raising colors or eating breakfast, completely unaware that the drone of engines signals the end of peace and the beginning of a catastrophe. The attack unfolds with surgical precision and terrifying violence as torpedo bombers swoop low over the water, releasing specially modified shallow-water torpedoes. These weapons slam into the hulls of the battleships Oklahoma, West Virginia, and California, tearing them open and sending them listing into the mud. Simultaneously, dive bombers scream down from high altitude to punish the airfields at Hickam and Wheeler, destroying rows of American aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip. The air fills with heavy black smoke, the roar of explosions, and the screams of men trapped in the burning wreckage of what was once the pride of the Navy. The most horrific moment arrives when a high-altitude armor-piercing bomb strikes the forward magazine of the USS Arizona. The resulting explosion lifts the 30,000-ton battleship out of the water, instantly killing over 1,000 sailors and Marines in a fireball that sears the retina. The ship collapses into a twisted tomb of melting steel, oil, and bone, becoming the tragic centerpiece of the devastation. In less than 2 hours, the Japanese destroy or damage all 8 battleships, but crucially, they miss the American aircraft carriers, which are out at sea. and fail to destroy the vital oil storage tanks and dry docks. While the smoke rises over Hawaii, the Japanese military launches a synchronized centrifugal offensive across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, striking targets thousands of miles apart. Within hours of the Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese forces bomb American bases in the Philippines, invade Thailand and Malaya, and assault the British territory of Hong Kong. This coordinated blitzkrieg is designed to overwhelm the Western colonial powers before they can recover from the shock of the initial assaults. The swiftness of the Japanese advance stuns the Allied commanders, who had dismissed the Japanese as incapable of such complex, multi-theater operations. In the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur, despite having hours of warning after the news from Pearl Harbor, fails to disperse his air forces at Clark Field. Japanese bombers catch the American B-17 flying fortresses on the ground, destroying half of the Far East Air Force in a single afternoon and securing immediate air superiority. Without air cover, the American and Filipino ground forces are defenseless against the Japanese landings at Lingayen Gulf. General Masaharu Homa's 14th Army pushes rapidly toward Manila, forcing MacArthur to declare it an open city and retreat to the jungle peninsula of Bataan. Meanwhile, on the Malay Peninsula, the Japanese 25th Army under General Tomoyuki Yamashita executes a brilliant campaign that shatters the myth of British military superiority. Moving through jungles that the British considered impassable, Japanese troops on bicycles outmaneuver the static defensive lines. Advancing hundreds of miles in weeks, the British reliance on naval power suffers a catastrophic blow on December 10, when Japanese land-based bombers sink the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. The loss of Force Z leaves the coast of Malaya completely exposed and signals the end of the battleship era. By February 1942, the Japanese army stands at the gates of Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, a fortress symbolizing British dominance in Asia. The British guns, largely positioned to defend against a naval attack from the sea, are useless against the Japanese assault coming from the landward side. Water supplies are cut, and morale collapses as the city is subjected to relentless artillery bombardment and air raids. On February 15, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrenders the garrison of 80,000 men to a numerically inferior Japanese force, marking the largest capitulation in British military history and the effective end of the British Empire in the East. Back in the Philippines, the situation on the Bataan Peninsula deteriorates into a nightmare of starvation, disease, and constant shelling. The battling bastards of Bataan, suffering from malaria and dysentery, hold out for months against the Japanese onslaught, delaying the Japanese timetable significantly. However, with no hope of reinforcement or resupply from the United States, the defense is doomed to failure. On April 9, 1942, Major General Edward King is forced to surrender the Bataan forces, handing over 75,000 starving American and Filipino troops to an enemy that views surrender as the ultimate disgrace. What follows is the Bataan Death March, a war crime of staggering brutality that reveals the dark side of the Japanese military code of Bushido. The prisoners are forced to march 65 miles in the scorching tropical heat to Camp O'Donnell, denied food, water, and rest. Those who fall behind, collapse from exhaustion, or attempt to drink from roadside puddles are bayoneted, beheaded, or shot by their captors. Thousands die along the dusty road, their bodies left to rot in the sun, sowing a seed of hatred in the American consciousness that will fuel the war's savagery for years to come. While the Americans suffer in the Philippines, the Japanese turn their attention to the ultimate prize, the Dutch East Indies and its vast oil reserves. A multinational naval force known as ABDACOM, American, British, Dutch, Australian Command, attempts to intercept the invasion fleet in the Java Sea. In a confusing night engagement in late February 1942, the Allied fleet is systematically destroyed by the superior optics and torpedoes of the Japanese Imperial Navy. With the Allied Navy swept aside, Japanese troops land on Java, securing the oil fields and refineries that were the primary catalyst for the entire war. By the spring of 1942, the Japanese Empire has reached its zenith, controlling a vast expanse of ocean and territory stretching from the borders of India to the Central Pacific. The southern resources area is secured, and the defensive perimeter is established. Exceeding the wildest dreams of the pre-war planners, a dangerous malady known as victory disease begins to infect the Japanese high command, leading to overconfidence and a belief in their own invincibility. They believe the Americans are soft and demoralized, incapable of mounting a serious counteroffensive for years. However, a psychological shock arrives on April 18, 1942, when 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, appear over the skies of Tokyo. Launched from the carrier USS Hornet deep in the Pacific, the raiders drop their modest payloads on the Japanese capital before flying on to crash land in China. While the physical damage is negligible, the psychological impact is profound, proving that the emperor is not safe in his own palace. This embarrassment compels Admiral Yamamoto to accelerate his plans to draw the American carriers into a decisive battle, setting the stage for a showdown at a tiny atoll called Midway. June 4, 1942. The Pacific Ocean, roughly 1,000 miles northwest of Hawaii. The morning sun glints off the calm waters, betraying no sign of the violence about to erupt. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto has spread his massive armada across thousands of miles of ocean, a complex tapestry of diversionary strikes and main battle groups designed to lure the American fleet into a fatal trap. He believes he possesses the element of surprise, confident that the Americans are demoralized and unaware of his true intentions. However, in a nondescript basement in Pearl Harbor known as the Dungeon, Commander Joe Rochefort and his team of codebreakers have already won the first phase of the battle. Having cracked the Japanese naval code JN-25B, the Americans know exactly where, when, and in what strength the enemy will appear. Admiral Chester Nimitz, armed with this priceless intelligence, takes a calculated gamble that strips the defense of Hawaii to the bone. He sends his 3 available aircraft carriers, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, to a point northeast of Midway called Point Luck. Instead of being the victims of a surprise attack, the Americans are lying in wait, prepared to ambush the ambushers. The fate of the war now rests on the shoulders of young naval aviators flying canvas-covered biplanes and heavy monoplanes into the teeth of the world's most experienced carrier force. The battle opens with a Japanese airstrike on Midway Island itself, which inflicts heavy damage but fails to knock out the airfield. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier strike force, faces a critical dilemma that will determine the outcome of the war. Believing no American ships are in the area, he orders his reserve aircraft, currently armed with torpedoes for ship-to-ship combat, to be rearmed with land attack bombs for a second strike on the island. Suddenly, a scout plane reports the sighting of an American task force, throwing the Japanese command into disarray. Nagumo dithers, caught between launching an immediate but uncoordinated strike or waiting to recover his returning planes and reorganize. While he hesitates, the first waves of American torpedo bombers from the Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown arrive. These slow, low-flying TBD devastators are slaughtered by the Japanese combat air patrol of Zero fighters, which swoop down like hawks. Squadron after squadron is wiped out without scoring a single hit, their sacrifice seemingly in vain as the Japanese carriers sail on, apparently invincible and untouched. However, the sacrifice of the torpedo bombers draws the Japanese Zeros down to sea level, leaving the skies above the fleet completely undefended. At 10:20 a.m., a high-pitched whine signals the arrival of the American SBD Dauntless dive bombers. Led by Lieutenant Commanders Wade McCluskey and Max Leslie, they tip over into steep dives, screaming down from 15,000 feet toward the decks of the Japanese carriers, which are now cluttered with refueling planes and exposed munitions. In a span of 5 terrifying minutes, the course of history is irrevocably altered. The American bombs strike the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu with devastating precision, punching through the flight decks and detonating amidst the fully fueled aircraft and loose ordnance in the hangars below. The Japanese carriers are instantly transformed into floating infernos, their internal explosions ripping the ships apart from the inside out. The pride of the Imperial Navy, the force that terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, is reduced to burning scrap metal in the time it takes to smoke a cigarette. Although the surviving carrier Hiryu manages to launch a counterstrike that eventually sinks the USS Yorktown, her victory is short-lived as American dive bombers locate and destroy her later that afternoon. The Battle of Midway ends with the loss of all 4 Japanese heavy carriers and the cream of their naval aviation pilots. The strategic initiative rips violently away from Japan. For the first time, they are forced onto the defensive. Yet, the war is far from over. The conflict now shifts from the clean, open waters of the Central Pacific to the dark, malarial jungles of the Solomon Islands. In August 1942, the Allies launch Operation Watchtower, targeting the island of Guadalcanal, where the Japanese are constructing an airfield that threatens the supply lines to Australia. On August 7, 1942, the U.S. 1st Marine Division lands on Guadalcanal and the neighboring island of Tulagi, catching the Japanese defenders completely by surprise. They quickly seize the partially completed airfield, renaming it Henderson Field, and establish a tenuous perimeter. But the Japanese response is swift and furious. On the night of August 8, a Japanese cruiser force races into the Sound between Guadalcanal and Florida Island, engaging the Allied naval screen, protecting the transports. In the Battle of Savo Island, the Japanese inflict the worst open-sea defeat in United States naval history, sinking 4 heavy cruisers in a display of terrifying night-fighting proficiency. The Allied transport fleet, vulnerable and terrified, weighs anchor and flees, taking most of the Marines' supplies and heavy equipment with them. The 11,000 Marines ashore are stranded, cut off from the outside world. With limited ammunition and food, they are now besieged on a hostile island where the jungle itself is an enemy, teeming with malaria-carrying mosquitoes, rot, and stifling heat. They dig in around Henderson Field, knowing that holding the airstrip is the only thing keeping them alive. The Cactus Air Force, a ragtag collection of Marine, Navy, and Army pilots, flies from the cratered runway to contest control of the skies and the sea. The Japanese Army, accustomed to easy victories, underestimates the resolve of the American Marines. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki leads an elite detachment of 900 men to retake the airfield, believing a single bayonet charge will break the enemy's spirit. On the night of August 21, at the Battle of the Tenaru River, Ichiki's men charge, screaming into the interlocking fire of Marine machine guns. The slaughter is absolute. The Japanese are mowed down in waves, and Colonel Ichiki commits ritual suicide in disgrace. It is a shocking introduction to a new kind of war, where surrender is not an option and annihilation is the only outcome. In September, the Japanese escalate their efforts, landing a brigade under General Kawaguchi to assault the Marine perimeter from the south. The defense falls to a battalion of Marine raiders led by Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson, stationed on a grass-covered coral ridge just south of the airfield. For 2 hellish nights, the Battle of Edson's Ridge rages at point-blank range. Japanese soldiers crawl over the bodies of their fallen comrades to reach the Marine foxholes, only to be met with grenades and knife fighting. The ridge is held by the thinnest of margins, forcing the Japanese back into the jungle, leaving hundreds of dead to rot in the tropical sun. The waters north of Guadalcanal, dubbed Iron Bottom Sound due to the sheer number of ships sunk there, become a graveyard for both navies. The Tokyo Express, a nightly run of Japanese destroyers delivering troops and supplies, engages in ferocious battles with American surface groups. In November, the naval battle of Guadalcanal sees battleships clashing at close range in the darkness. The USS Washington, using radar-controlled gunnery, devastates the Japanese battleship Kirishima, sending her to the bottom. These naval engagements bleed the Japanese navy of destroyers and transports it cannot replace, slowly strangling the troops ashore. On the island, the situation for the Japanese ground forces deteriorates into a nightmare of starvation and disease. Cut off from supplies by the growing dominance of American air and naval power, the once proud soldiers are reduced to eating roots, lizards, and even the leather straps of their equipment. Dysentery and malaria ravage their ranks more effectively than American bullets, turning the 17th Army into a force of walking skeletons. They call the place Starvation Island, a living hell where the jungle floor consumes the dead and the dying alike. By early 1943, the Japanese High Command finally accepts the reality that Guadalcanal is lost. In a masterfully executed withdrawal known as Operation Key, Japanese destroyers evacuate the surviving 10,000 troops under the cover of darkness, leaving behind over 20,000 dead. The Americans, expecting one final banzai charge, cautiously advance only to find empty camps and mass graves. The victory at Guadalcanal proves that the Japanese army can be defeated on the ground. But the cost has been exorbitant. The myth of the Superman has been shattered, replaced by a grim understanding of the bloody road that lies ahead. The twin victories at Midway and Guadalcanal mark the permanent turning of the tide in the Pacific War. Japan has lost its strategic initiative, its best carrier pilots, and the aura of invincibility that fueled its early conquests. The United States, its industrial engine now fully revving, prepares to move from defense to offense. The road to Tokyo is open, but it is paved with thousands of islands, each one a potential fortress, each one demanding a price in blood that will only grow steeper as the Allies approach the Japanese homeland. The year 1944 opens with the Japanese Empire trapped in a tightening strategic vice. Yet the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo refuses to accept the inevitability of defeat. While Allied forces island hop across the Central Pacific, the Japanese High Command gazes at a map of mainland China with desperation. Launching Operation Ichigo, this massive offensive is the largest ground operation in the history of the Japanese army. Mobilizing over 500,000 men, 800 tanks, and thousands of artillery pieces, the objective is to secure a continuous land route from Korea to Indochina and destroy the American air bases in southern China that are menacing Japanese shipping. A gamble that strips the defense of the homeland to fuel a fire on the continent. In April, the Japanese Northern China Area Army smashes into the nationalist forces in Hainan province like a mechanized sledgehammer. General Tang Enbo's armies, demoralized by years of neglect, corruption, and lack of supplies, crumble under the weight of the sudden assault. The Japanese tanks roar across the flat plains, encircling hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers who surrender or flee in total disarray. The speed of the advance is terrifying. Within weeks, the Japanese capture the strategic railway junctions of Luoyang and Zhengzhou. The famine-stricken peasantry, bitter toward their own government's previous failures, sometimes attacks the retreating Chinese soldiers, adding a layer of tragic civil strife to the rout. The offensive pivots south toward Hunan in the summer, targeting the city of Changsha, which has successfully repelled 3 previous Japanese invasions. This time, the Japanese 11th Army brings overwhelming force and chemical weapons, finally breaching the city's defenses in June after a brutal siege. The drive continues to Hengyang, where the Chinese 10th Army puts up a legendary defense that temporarily halts the Japanese juggernaut. For 47 days, General Fang Xianjue's men hold out against human wave attacks, reducing the city to rubble and inflicting massive casualties on the invaders. The fall of Hengyang in August completes the land link to Indochina, a tactical masterpiece that comes too late to change the strategic reality. While the Japanese army celebrates hollow victories in the rice paddies of China, a catastrophe unfolds thousands of miles away in the Central Pacific. The American Fifth Fleet, a massive armada of fast carriers and battleships under Admiral Raymond Spruance, sets its sights on the Mariana Islands Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands are not just coral atolls, they are vital, unsinkable aircraft carriers, located within B-29 bomber range of Tokyo. The Japanese defenders, dug into caves and limestone ridges, know that losing the Marianas means the Emperor's palace will soon be under the shadow of American wings, making the defense of these islands a matter of existential importance. On June 19, 1944, the Japanese mobile fleet under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa attempts to relieve the garrison on Saipan by challenging the U.S. Navy in the Philippine Sea. Ozawa launches hundreds of aircraft in massive waves, relying on the longer range of his lighter planes to strike the Americans first. However, American radar picks them up miles away, and the Hellcat fighters of Task Force 58 rise to meet them in perfect formation. The result is a massacre known to history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Inexperienced Japanese pilots are swatted from the sky by veteran American aviators. Nearly 400 Japanese planes are destroyed in a single afternoon for the loss of less than 30 Americans. On the beaches of Saipan, the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions storm ashore under a blistering sun and heavy mortar fire. The terrain is a nightmare of steep cliffs, sugarcane fields, and hidden bunkers that turn every yard of advance into a bloody struggle. General Yoshitsugu Saito commands the 30,000 Japanese defenders to fight to the death, utilizing a defense-in-depth strategy that bleeds the Marines for every inch of ground. The fighting is savage and intimate, often occurring at grenade range in the jagged Death Valley where the heat, the flies, and the smell of decaying bodies test the sanity of the attackers. As the Americans push north, the horror of Saipan reaches a tragic crescendo involving the island's civilian population. Terrified by Japanese propaganda claiming the Americans will torture and eat them, thousands of civilians retreat to the northern cliffs of Marpi Point. Despite pleas from American interpreters and captured Japanese civilians to surrender safely, mothers throw their babies off the precipice before jumping to their own deaths on the jagged rocks below. Whole families commit suicide with grenades or by leaping into the churning sea. A spectacle of mass hysteria that leaves battle-hardened Marines weeping in disbelief at the senseless waste of life. The fall of Saipan in July 1944 sends a shockwave through the Japanese political establishment that shakes the foundations of the government. For the first time, the inner circle realizes that the war is irretrievably lost, as the home islands are now within range of strategic destruction. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, the architect of the war and the face of Japanese militarism, is forced to resign in disgrace, admitting his failure to protect the national polity. Yet, the war does not end. The hardliners insist on fighting on, hoping to bleed the Americans enough to secure a negotiated peace that preserves the imperial system. Following the Marianas, the American juggernaut turns its attention to the Palau Islands to protect General MacArthur's flank for the invasion of the Philippines. The battle for Peleliu, expected to last 4 days, turns into a 2-month grinder of attrition. The Japanese commander, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, abandons the beach defense strategy in favor of a honeycombed network of caves in the Umubrugol mountain. The 1st Marine Division is decimated trying to clear these positions, facing an enemy that refuses to banzai charge, choosing instead to stay hidden and kill from the shadows until they are burned out by flamethrowers and satchel charges. In October 1944, General Douglas MacArthur fulfills his vow to return to the Philippines, wading ashore at Leyte with the cameras rolling. The Japanese Navy, desperate to halt the invasion, commits the remainder of its fleet in a complex, 3-pronged attack that leads to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. The engagement is a chaotic, sprawling melee involving battleships, carriers, and PT boats across hundreds of miles of ocean. It witnesses the end of the Japanese Navy as an effective fighting force, as their super battleship Musashi is pummeled into submission by waves of American carrier planes, capsizing and taking 1,000 men to the bottom. Amidst the desperation of Leyte Gulf, a terrifying new tactic emerges from the Japanese Naval Air Service. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, realizing that conventional attacks are no longer effective against the American wall of anti-aircraft fire, organizes the Special Attack Units. Young pilots, barely trained to fly, are given a ceremonial cup of sake and a plane loaded with explosives to crash directly into Allied ships. The first successful kamikaze attacks strike the escort carriers off Samar, sinking the USS St. Lo and introducing a psychological horror that freezes the blood of American sailors who must now fight guided human missiles. Back on the conquered island of Saipan, the Seabees work around the clock to transform the coral runways into massive air bases capable of handling the B-29 superfortress. In late 1944, the first of these silver giants arrive at Isley Field, their 4 engines roaring with the promise of destruction. General Curtis LeMay takes command, analyzing the failures of high-altitude precision bombing over the cloudy skies of Japan. He begins to formulate a new strategy, one that will trade altitude for payload and precision for area destruction, aiming to burn the wood and paper cities of Japan to the ground. As 1944 draws to a close, the Japanese Empire is a broken shell, its outer perimeter shattered and its navy at the bottom of the sea. Operation Ichigo has achieved a tactical land victory in China, creating a corridor that leads nowhere, while the strategic war is being lost in the Pacific. The blockade by American submarines has strangled the flow of oil and food to the home islands, leaving the population hungry and the factories idle. The ring of steel has closed around Japan, and the stage is set for the final apocalyptic act of the war on the doorstep of the Emperor himself. February 19, 1945. The tiny, sulfur-reeking island of Iwo Jima shudders under the heaviest pre-landing bombardment of the Pacific War. Battleships like the USS Tennessee and USS Nevada pound the volcanic rock for days, turning the landscape into a lunar surface of grey ash and craters. Yet, beneath the pockmarked ground, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi waits with supreme patience in a command bunker made of reinforced concrete. Unlike previous commanders who wasted their men in futile banzai charges at the water's edge, Kuribayashi has forbidden suicide attacks, ordering his 21,000 men to kill 10 Americans for every Japanese life lost. He has turned the island into a massive underground fortress, connecting 18 miles of tunnels, caves, and pillboxes that are virtually immune to naval gunfire. When the first wave of the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions hits the black volcanic beaches, they are met with an eerie silence that unsettles the veterans. It is a trap. Once the beaches are clogged with men and machinery struggling for traction in the shifting volcanic sand, Kuribayashi unleashes hell. Hidden artillery and machine gun nests on the slopes of Mount Suribachi and the northern plateaus open fire simultaneously, raining steel upon the exposed Marines. The carnage is immediate and staggering. As men are cut down in swathes by enemies they cannot see, the volcanic ash absorbs the blood of thousands, turning the landing zone into a terrifying killbox where there is nowhere to hide and nowhere to run. The battle for Mount Suribachi, the dormant volcano dominating the southern tip of the island, becomes a grueling 4-day ascent into the face of death. Marines crawl upward inch by inch, blasting caves with satchel charges and flamethrowers to silence the enemy guns. On February 23, a patrol reaches the summit, and 5 Marines and a Navy corpsman raise a makeshift American flag on a length of pipe. The sight of the stars and stripes fluttering over the highest point of the island triggers a roar of cheers from the beaches below and the ships offshore. Photographer Joe Rosenthal captures the second raising of a larger flag, immortalizing the moment. But for the men on the ground, the celebration is brief. The battle is far from over. The fighting shifts to the northern plateau, a twisted landscape of rock formations and gorges dubbed the meat grinder by the men who have to traverse it. Here, the Japanese defense is at its most fanatical, utilizing spider holes to pop up behind marine lines, shoot, and vanish back into the earth. The Americans respond with the brutal blowtorch and corkscrew tactic, using flamethrower tanks to spray liquid fire into the tunnel entrances, while demolition teams seal the exits with explosives. It is a slow, methodical process of extermination that tests the psychological limits of the attackers. By the time the island is declared secure in late March, nearly 7,000 Americans are dead, and almost the entire Japanese garrison has been wiped out, refusing to surrender to the very end. While the Marines bleed on the black sands of Iwo Jima to secure emergency landing strips, General Curtis LeMay sits in the Marianas, planning a campaign that will burn the heart out of the Japanese Empire. He analyzes the failure of high-altitude precision bombing, which has been thwarted by the jet stream winds over Japan that scatter bombs harmlessly. LeMay makes a cold, calculating decision to strip the B-29 superfortresses of their defensive guns and heavy armor, loading them to capacity with E-46 incendiary clusters. He orders the pilots to fly low, at 5,000 feet, and at night, targeting the dense, wood and paper working-class districts of Tokyo. It is a shift from targeting factories to targeting the workers who man them. On the night of March 9, 1945, Operation Meeting House begins as over 300 B-29 seconds roar over the Japanese capital. The Pathfinders drop napalm canisters to mark the target zone with a flaming X, and the main force follows, unleashing a torrent of gelid gasoline and white phosphorus. The strong winds fan the flames into a superheated firestorm that sucks the oxygen out of the air, creating a cyclone of fire that moves faster than a running man. The temperature on the ground reaches 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, melting glass, boiling the water in the canals, and turning the asphalt streets into sticky rivers of fire that trap the fleeing civilians. The destruction in Tokyo that night exceeds the devastation of any single air raid in history, including the atomic bombings that are yet to come. 16 square miles of the capital are incinerated, and an estimated 100,000 men, women, and children are burned to death in the inferno. American crews flying overhead report the smell of burning flesh permeating their cabins, a grim testament to the scale of the slaughter below. The raid shatters the illusion of safety in the Japanese homeland, proving that the government can no longer protect its people. Yet, despite the apocalyptic destruction, the imperial government refuses to capitulate, forcing the Allies to prepare for the next stepping stone, Okinawa. April 1, 1945, falls on Easter Sunday and April Fool's Day, marking the beginning of Operation Iceberg. The invasion of Okinawa. It is the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War, involving a fleet of over 1,500 ships and 180,000 troops. The landing is deceptively easy, as the Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, has pulled his forces back from the beaches to the rugged southern terrain. He knows he cannot stop the landing, so he intends to bleed the Americans in a protracted war of attrition centered on the fortified Shuri line. The initial calm entices the Americans inland, drawing them into a kill zone that will become known as the Typhoon of Steel. Desperate to halt the invasion, the Japanese Navy plays its final card, the super battleship Yamato. In a mission dubbed Operation Tengo, the massive vessel is loaded with only enough fuel for a one-way trip, ordered to beach itself on Okinawa and act as an unsinkable artillery battery. However, American intelligence intercepts the plan, and on April 7, carrier aircraft swarm the lone battleship. Wave after wave of Helldivers and Avengers pummel the giant with torpedoes and bombs. Without air cover, the Yamato is helpless. She capsizes and explodes, taking 3,000 sailors and the last vestiges of Japanese naval power to the bottom of the East China Sea. On Okinawa, the ground war degenerates into a muddy, bloody stalemate reminiscent of the trenches of World War I. The Americans face a series of fortified ridges, Kakazu, Hacksaw, and Sugarloaf, where Japanese machine guns cover every approach. The fighting is relentless, worsened by torrential rains that turn the battlefield into a quagmire of rotting corpses and mud. At Hacksaw Ridge, a conscientious objector named Desmond Doss saves 75 men, lowering them one by one down a cliff face under heavy fire. His heroism shines as a beacon of humanity in a battle where mercy has largely been forgotten by both sides. Offshore, the U.S. Navy faces a horror of its own, the Kikusui or floating chrysanthemum waves of kamikaze attacks. Thousands of Japanese planes, many piloted by university students with barely enough training to take off, fling themselves at the Allied fleet. The radar picket destroyers, stationed on the perimeter to warn the main fleet, take the brunt of the assault. The USS Laffey survives hits from 6 kamikazes and 4 bombs in a single hour, earning the nickname the ship that would not die. The psychological toll on the sailors is immense, as they spend days and nights at battle stations, watching human missiles rain from the sky in a terrifying display of the Japanese refusal to surrender. The tragedy of Okinawa extends to the civilian population, who are caught in the crossfire of the relentless artillery duels, subjected to intense propaganda claiming the Americans are devils who will rape and torture them. Thousands of Okinawans hide in the caves with the Japanese soldiers. In many cases, the soldiers use the civilians as human shields or force them to commit suicide rather than be captured. The cliffs of the island become scenes of horror as parents leap to their deaths clutching their children, driven by fear and the coercive orders of the Imperial Army. It is estimated that 1/3 of the civilian population of Okinawa perishes during the battle. By late June, the Japanese defense collapses as General Ushijima and his chief of staff commit ritual suicide in their cave headquarters. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., the American commander, is killed by shrapnel just days before the victory, becoming the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy fire in the war. The island is declared secure, but the cost is staggering: over 12,000 American dead and 36,000 wounded, with more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians killed. The Typhoon of Steel has left the island a wasteland, a grim preview of what an invasion of the Japanese main islands would entail. With Okinawa and Iwo Jima in American hands, the noose around Japan is tight, but the will of the imperial leadership remains unbroken. The planners in Washington look at the casualty figures from Okinawa and shudder, projecting millions of casualties for the planned invasion of Kyushu and Honshu, codenamed Operation Downfall. President Harry S. Truman, having succeeded Roosevelt after his death in April, faces a choice between a prolonged, bloody invasion and a new, terrible weapon developed in the deserts of New Mexico. The stage is set for the final, unimaginable act of the war, where the power of the sun itself will be unleashed to force an empire to its knees. July 1945 finds the world holding its breath as the Allied leaders gather in the rubble of a defeated Germany for the Potsdam Conference. President Harry S. Truman, armed with the secret knowledge of a successful atomic test in the New Mexico desert, issues a final ultimatum to the Empire of Japan. The Potsdam Declaration demands unconditional surrender, warning of prompt and utter destruction if the terms are ignored. In Tokyo, the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War receives the message with a mixture of contempt and desperation. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki uses the term mokusatsu to describe their response, a word implying a killing silence or contemptuous ignoring, hoping for a Soviet mediation that will never come. On the coral island of Tinian in the Marianas, the 509th Composite Group makes final preparations for a mission that will alter the trajectory of human history. Colonel Paul Tibbets, a pilot of steely nerves, stands before his B-29 superfortress, which he has named Enola Gay after his mother. In the humidity of the tropical night, technicians hoist a 4-ton uranium bomb, codenamed Little Boy, into the belly of the silver giant. The atmosphere on the tarmac is heavy with the weight of the unknown, as no one knows for certain if the device will function as calculated or if the plane will survive the blast. At 2:45 a.m. on August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay roars down the runway, struggling to lift the immense weight of the bomb before clawing its way into the dark sky. The 6-hour flight to the Japanese main islands is uneventful, a quiet prelude to the coming apocalypse. As the sun rises, the weather reconnaissance planes report clear skies over the primary target, the bustling port city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb bay doors open, and the weapon falls away, plummeting for 43 seconds before its radar fuse triggers the detonator. A blinding flash, brighter than 1,000 suns, ignites the sky, silencing the morning bustle of the city forever. The detonation occurs at 1,900 feet, creating a fireball that instantly vaporizes everything within a mile of ground zero. Tens of thousands of people, soldiers doing calisthenics, children walking to school, commuters on streetcars are reduced to carbon shadows etched into the stone. The blast wave follows seconds later, moving at the speed of sound, flattening buildings and crushing those who survived the initial flash. A mushroom cloud boils up into the stratosphere, carrying with it the ashes of a city that has ceased to exist. In a single heartbeat, 70,000 lives are extinguished, and the world enters the terrifying new reality of the atomic age. While Japan reels from the destruction of Hiroshima, a second hammer blow falls from the north. On August 9, honoring a secret pledge made at Yalta, the Soviet Union declares war on Japan and launches Operation August Storm. Over 1 million battle-hardened Soviet troops, accompanied by thousands of T-34 tanks, pour across the borders into Manchuria. The Japanese Kwantung Army, once the pride of the empire, but now stripped of its best units to defend the homeland, collapses under the sheer weight of the Red Army's mechanized pincer movement. The illusion that the Soviets would mediate a peace deal is shattered, leaving Japan completely isolated. On the same morning of August 9, another B-29, named Boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, arrives over the city of Kokura with a plutonium bomb named Fat Man. Heavy smoke and haze obscure the primary target, forcing Sweeney to make the fateful decision to divert to the secondary target, Nagasaki. Running low on fuel, the plane navigates through clouds to find a break over the Urakami Valley. At 11:02 a.m., the second atomic bomb is released. The surrounding hills contain the blast somewhat, but the destruction is nonetheless absolute, obliterating the Mitsubishi steelworks and killing 40,000 people instantly. The twin shocks of the atomic bombings and the Soviet invasion finally break the deadlock within the Japanese government. In a sweltering underground bunker near the Imperial Palace, the Big Six leaders argue fiercely, with the military faction led by War Minister Korechika Anami still demanding a fight to the death. They argue that a final battle on the home islands will inflict such casualties that the Americans will sue for peace. Seeing his cabinet paralyzed, Emperor Hirohito breaks with centuries of tradition and intervenes directly. In a voice trembling with emotion, he declares that the unendurable must be endured, ordering the government to accept the Allied terms. Fanatical elements within the military, refusing to accept surrender, launch a desperate coup d'état on the night of August 14, known as the Kyujo Incident. Major Kenji Hatanaka leads a group of young officers who seize the Imperial Palace, killing the commander of the Imperial Guard, Lieutenant General Takeshi Mori. They frantically search the labyrinthine corridors for the recording of the Emperor's surrender speech, intending to destroy it and force the war to continue. The coup fails as the bulk of the army remains loyal to the Emperor's command, and as dawn breaks, Hatanaka and his conspirators commit ritual suicide on the palace grounds. At noon on August 15, 1945, the Japanese people gather around radios to hear the voice of their emperor for the very first time. In the dual voice broadcast, speaking in a formal, archaic court language that many struggle to understand, Hirohito announces the acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. He does not use the word surrender, but speaks of the war situation developing not necessarily to Japan's advantage and the enemy's use of a new and most cruel bomb. Across the ruined cities, people fall to their knees, weeping in a mixture of shame, relief, and profound exhaustion. The war is over. The occupation begins swiftly as American transport planes land at Atsugi Airfield, bringing the first wave of conquerors to Japanese soil. General Douglas MacArthur arrives, descending from his plane with his signature corncob pipe, embodying the new authority. The Japanese populace, terrified by years of propaganda predicting rape and torture, peers cautiously from behind shuttered windows. Instead of vengeance, they encounter GIs handing out chocolate and cigarettes, a psychological shock that begins the slow process of dismantling the militaristic mindset. The silence of the guns is replaced by the roar of jeeps and the machinery of a country beginning to rebuild from zero. On September 2, 1945, the final act of the tragedy plays out in Tokyo Bay aboard the battleship USS Missouri. Under a grey, overcast sky, representatives of the Allied powers gather on the deck, surrounded by a massive armada of warships. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, struggling with his wooden leg, and General Yoshijiro Umezu, the grim-faced chief of the General Staff, arrive to sign the instrument of surrender. They are met by the stern gazes of American, British, Chinese, Soviet, and other Allied officers, including the gaunt figures of Generals Wainwright and Percival. Recently released from brutal Japanese captivity, General MacArthur steps forward to preside over the ceremony, delivering a speech not of triumph, but of somber hope for a better world. He speaks of the need for the spirit of mankind to rise above the carnage of the past, setting a tone of reconciliation rather than retribution. With the scratching of pens on parchment, the bloodiest conflict in human history is formally concluded. MacArthur steps to the microphone and speaks the final words to a waiting world. These proceedings are closed. A massive flyover of hundreds of American aircraft roars overhead, signaling the definitive end of the Japanese Empire. For China, The end of the war brings a moment of jubilant celebration that is quickly overshadowed by the looming specter of civil war. The war of resistance has cost the Chinese people over 20 million lives, leaving a legacy of pain and devastation that will take generations to heal. The retreating Japanese armies leave behind a land scarred by trenches, flooded rivers, and burnt villages. Yet, the victory restores China's status as a great power, ending the century of humiliation and securing its seat on the United Nations Security Council. The external enemy is gone, but the internal struggle for the soul of the nation is just beginning. Across the Pacific, millions of soldiers begin the long journey home, leaving behind the graves of their comrades on remote islands with names like Tarawa, Peleliu, and Okinawa. They return to a world permanently changed, where the United States stands as the dominant global superpower and the old colonial empires of Europe are crumbling. The soldiers carry with them the physical and mental scars of a savage war, memories of jungle rot, banzai charges, and the loss of innocence. The world they build from the ashes will be defined by the lessons learned in the crucible of the Pacific War. The Empire of the Sun has set, replaced by a Japan that renounces war and turns its energy toward economic resurrection. The atomic shadows on the pavements of Hiroshima serve as a permanent warning to humanity of the cost of total war. From the Marco Polo Bridge to the deck of the Missouri, the conflict has consumed the lives of millions and reshaped the geopolitical map of Asia. As the sun sets over Tokyo Bay, the waters that once burned with oil and blood are finally calm, reflecting a fragile peace purchased at an unimaginable price.